Welcome to Straight Talk with Sid. Today I want to talk about a poll that did not receive enough attention in my opinion. And that was a poll conducted about 2 years ago by Nanos Research on behalf of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. That poll was absolutely shocking in terms of its findings.
As Canadians were being urged to stay home and help stop the spread of the coronavirus, too many had no home at all. A new survey reveals homelessness in this country is more common than previously reported. 5% of Canadians have experienced it firsthand. Another 31% know someone who's been homeless. CTV's Heather Wright on how the pandemic is compounding this crisis.
The number is staggering. A new poll suggests 1.6 million Canadians have at some point experienced homelessness, a number that could rise even further due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Part of the challenge has been really appreciating the scale of the challenge. This poll lays that bare.
It's an incredible figure for arguably one of the richest countries in the world. So let's take a look at how did we get here in the first place? Well, you probably recall in the 1980s, there was a great move, and one that I supported, to close mental institutions and treat those patients in their local communities. And that was a great idea on paper. But sadly and unfortunately, it did not translate into monies being transferred to the local communities to be able to deal with folks with mental health problems. Secondly, in the mid-1990s, you probably recall the federal government were absolutely addicted to lowering the Canadian deficit. And consequently, they basically cut transfer payments in the mid-1990s to all of the provinces by about $7 billion. And at the same time, they downloaded the building of affordable housing onto the backs of the provinces. The provinces in turn, you probably recall in the mid-1990s, Mike Harris gets elected in Ontario. And what does he do? He cuts welfare payments by 21%, leaving thousands of families absolutely destitute and in danger of being turfed out of their homes for their inability to be able to pay their rent. And at the same time, believe this or not, he actually froze the building of affordable homes. And he, in turn, downloaded the building of affordable homes to the municipalities, who clearly did not have the tax base to support building the amount of homes required to keep people with a shelter over their heads. By the way, at the same time as he froze the building of those affordable homes, there were 390 projects at the time with shovels in the ground in the process of being built that would have housed 17,000 people at the time, and that was stopped as well. So you can see the confluence of the federal government downloading responsibilities, cutting their transfer payments to the provinces, the advent of Mike Harris getting elected, cutting welfare by 21%, leaving people destitute, freezing the building of affordable homes at the same time, and downloading all of that onto the municipalities. That, my friends, is how we are in the crisis that we are in today. So let's take a look at the human suffering caused by homelessness in Canada. There are 10,000 people living in shelters in the city of Toronto. 3,500 of those are refugees, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But in the year 2021, there were over 200 deaths in the city of Toronto. And these are people who've touched the system. In other words, they were in the shelters or wherever, where the city was aware of them. That's not counting people in encampments, people who are basically homeless, living in derelict buildings or their cars, or wherever. So the numbers, you could argue, are actually much higher. In Winnipeg, They have all sorts of problems, and they did a point in time, 24-hour census, if you will, and there were 2,000 people basically on the streets, living, not so much on the streets, but living in shelters. Of that, there were something like 200 people, 357 actually, living on the streets on that particular night. In Vancouver, the death rate is 153 deaths on average every single year. Most of that is through opioid addictions. But regardless of the cause, there are people dying on the streets. In Toronto, there are people living under bridges. They're living amongst the rats. Rats, they say, as big as cats, is what they encounter on a nightly basis.
I mean, what scares you living here?
The rats. The rats, okay, is big like a cat.
And they're here at night?
Yeah.
Every night?
Every night. Yeah, every night.
And what do you do?
I'm hiding in my tent.
You know, I have to remind myself, this is Canada, downtown Toronto.
So the crisis is not just, in Toronto or the large urban centres. It is right across the country. It's of epidemic proportions. And yet we don't seem to be able to get a response from all the different levels of government responsible for dealing with this issue. Let's just take the refugees. The new mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, she basically asked the federal government, upon taking office, she said, look, there are 3,500 refugees amongst the 10,000 shelters that we have, shelter spaces that we have in Toronto. 3,500 are basically taken up, or in some cases, by refugees. And we need to be able to deal with the refugees because many of them are living on the streets because there's not enough shelter space for the homeless and for the refugees. So she asked the federal government, whose responsibility is refugees. They bring in refugees from around the world, and rightfully so, and I support that 1,000%. But I also say at the same time, you got to be able to put the resources there to help the communities deal with the refugees when they show up on their doorstep. And when Olivia Chow asked the federal government, Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Finance, basically told her to go pound salt. Go talk to the provincial government. The provincial government basically said, no, you go pound salt, go talk to the federal government. So consequently, the city doesn't have the money to deal with a refugee crisis. The province are saying it's not our problem. And the federal government is saying, no, it's not our problem. We downloaded that problem, not to the provinces and the municipalities. So there we have the classic example of governments not even talking to each other. And in that, let's just listen to what the Attorney General had to say. What the Auditor General has to say about the lack of communications between the different levels of government and the government themselves not even knowing where they're spending their money and not being able to measure the outcomes to see if they're having any success.
There is still no organization in the federal government taking the lead on Canada's target to reduce chronic homelessness by 50% by 2028. In addition, the organizations did not know whether their efforts so far had improved housing outcomes for vulnerable Canadians. For example, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, as the lead for the National Housing Strategy, has spent about half of the roughly $9 billion it committed to the strategy, but it did not know whether those most in need benefited from these initiatives. This was because the corporation did not measure the changes in housing outcomes for priority vulnerable groups, including people experiencing homelessness.
So besides the runaway inflation, the cost of a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto is $2,400 per month. Or if you want to open the lens up a little bit and take a look across Canada, you're talking about $2,002 is the average rent right across the country. Now, if you're looking to buy a home and you're in the Toronto area and you're of modest income, you can forget about it. It's over $1 million to buy a relatively small home. In the rest of the GTA and across Canada, the average price last year was $700,000. Now, this means that if you happen to be working as a minimum wage worker, if you have even modest income, maybe with two members of your family are working, if you happen to be on welfare, if you happen to have a disability, you are seriously out of luck if you are out of a home. There is absolutely no chance that you're going to be able to afford rental accommodation or to buy a home in this current market, which means we've got hundreds of thousands of Canadians are trapped, basically either living where they are right now, some of them living rough on the streets, some of them living in shelters, some of them living in accommodation that's not fit for habitation, some living in derelict buildings, and sadly, some living underneath the bridges in encampments. These are the folks that we've forgotten about in this country. There are literally hundreds of thousands of them. It is important for us to understand how the stats are actually collected on the number of homeless people or those in danger of homelessness living in Canada. Currently, the system that's used by Stats Canada has 68 communities reporting to Stats Canada on a system that they refer to as point in time. What this basically means is that if you touch the system at some point, utilize the services of a shelter or some other service in the community that they're able to tabulate, those numbers get reported up to Stats Canada. And using that point in time system, they reckon there are 235,000 homeless people living in Canada every single year. Now, that system is flawed because it misses entire subgroups of people. For example, those in the LGBT community are highly unlikely to go to a shelter. Those veterans likewise are unlikely, or in most cases do not utilize those services. People who are sofa surfing are obviously not captured by those numbers. Those who are living in encampments and under bridges and in derelict buildings and in cars and so on, they're not covered by that system either. So you can see the system is basically flawed and underreports. Now, Cheryl Forchuk of the Lawson Institute in London, Ontario, conducted a survey over a 2-year period where she interviewed hundreds of folks who have utilized the services of these shelters, and also decided that a homeless person is, regardless if you're in a shelter or not, will probably have healthcare issues, mental health, addiction issues, and just a breakdown in their natural well-being. They will attend and show up in the emergency departments in our hospitals and other social services in the community. So by utilizing health records, she came up with a figure that basically says the Stats Canada number of 235 is underreporting by threefold, which would mean that the actual number of homeless folks on an annual basis in Canada is 700,000. That's shocking to find that there would be that many homeless people on an annual basis. And of course, these are only stats are coming in from 68 communities. Now, those communities may be pretty large, like the GTA and the Vancouver area. They'll cover a multitude of municipalities. But across Canada, there are 4,500 municipalities. There are 630 First Nation communities. And you can see those smaller communities, they simply just don't have the resources to be able to build affordable housing or to have shelters for the homeless in their communities in the dead of winter. So it is absolutely critical and important that we understand exactly how many homeless people there are in Canada and exactly where they are living. Listen to Polly Parsons from the Northern Policy Institute in Northern Ontario and what she has to say about the homeless situation in Northern Ontario.
The report looks at data compiled in 2021 and shows the per capita rate of homelessness is 3 times as high in some northern communities such as Cochrane when compared to a major urban centre like Ottawa. Holly Parsons wrote the report for the Northern Policy Institute.
Northerners and myself included have noticed, an increase of people struggling with homelessness, addiction, and mental health in our community, for me in Sudbury. So it was interesting to see that the data, in fact, matched that observation, and that, this is a kind of worsening crisis.
And the numbers also show the majority of those experiencing the crisis are Indigenous.
In the district of Kenora, 88% of their homeless population self-identify as Indigenous. And in fact, there were 5 northern districts that had over 60% of their homeless population self-identify as Indigenous.
It is clear that we have a serious problem when the 3 levels of government are not talking to each other. That's obviously a recipe for not being able to solve the problem. However, there are other issues that we need also to take a look at. And that is, some people will think that putting, $9 billion into solving the homeless crisis over a 10-year period is a lot of money, which is what Karen Good, the Auditor General, has been just talking about. But when you juxtapose that against other investments that the federal government are making, you can see how paltry the $9 billion figure actually is. I mean, just recently, the federal government decided to put $13 billion over the same period of time into the Volkswagen multinational corporation to build a battery plant in Ontario. Now, some will argue that that's a good thing to do. Personally, myself, I don't believe it is. I think there's other priorities in this country that we need to address, and clearly one of them is homelessness. I mean, just recently, there was another Nanos poll that I vehemently disagree with, and that is a poll that was basically asking Canadians what they thought about the investment being made by the federal government into a corporation. And I'm going to put it up on the screen for you to read, but I'll read it out because the small print the fine print is pretty small. So let me just read it out what it says. The question that they were asking: Canada's government agreed to incentives that may reach $13 billion over 10 years to secure a Volkswagen battery plant in Ontario. Some say this is a worthwhile investment as it will bring jobs and economic benefits, while others say the money should not be spent on jobs but on other priorities. Which of these 2 views comes closest to yours? Well, give me a break. I mean, what sort of a question was that to ask in the first instance? I mean, you're juxtaposing jobs against a nebulous question that doesn't define what the other social programs might be. Maybe if the question had been juxtaposed against, do you want to give $13 billion to a multinational corporation? Or do you want to spend that money trying to get the homeless people into homes? Wouldn't that be a better expenditure of our taxpayers' dollars? They also, by the way, just recently, or at least a couple of years ago, they put $4 billion into a pipeline. A pipeline? Are you kidding me? We're talking about the planet is burning. And we're talking about taking the dirtiest oil from Alberta and transporting it 1,000 miles across into British Columbia to be exported to the other side of the world to be burned, and increased climate change problems for all of us again. I mean, don't you see where our forests are burning around us? We're smothering in the smoke, and yet we're investing in fossil fuels when the world is turning away from fossil fuels. So yes, it is about priorities. It definitely is. It's about, do you want to put money into multinational corporations? Would it be those who pollute the planet? Or would it be those who are filthy rich to begin with? And we're going to give them $13 billion to create, 7,000 or 8,000 jobs? But if we put that money into affordable housing, for example, we would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Think about it. All the plumbers, the carpenters, the fitters, the roofers, all of these people will be put to work. Manufacturing, appliances and furniture. These are all the things that we could be doing with an investment, a serious investment into ending homelessness. And not a paltry sum of money, $9 billion over a 10-year period, which won't even put a dent in it. And as we've already heard from the Auditor General, Karen Good, they don't even know where they're spending that money. They don't even know if they're having any success with it or not. No, my friends, that is not the way to go. The way to go is to invest in affordable housing in a serious way and to fund both the provincial and the municipal levels of government. Give them the funding to get the homeless off the streets.